I work with the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. Welcome to this Civil Society Policy Forum session on navigating Africa's debt conundrum amid multiple crises, looking beyond the G20 Common Framework. The session really is about discussing the inadequacy of some of the debt relief measures that have been put forward to many of our countries on the continent, but in the global south more generally speaking, amidst the severe debt crisis that our regions have been facing. We are going to sort of drill down into the common framework because this is the framework that has been used and is being used by, so far only 4 countries, and all 4 of them being from the continent. And we will have an opportunity to understand from 2 countries that have applied more recently, we have Zambia and Ghana, to understand their experiences so far in engaging with the G20 Common Framework, as well as understanding some of the broader institutional and architectural issues that have contributed to the debt situation on the continent. We'll also have an opportunity to interrogate what the debt trajectory for the continent looks like, and what some of the analysis coming out of the World Bank is telling us, and what kind of things we need to be bracing ourselves for in the coming immediate to short term, but also what the implications are then for the medium to long term. It's been an interesting week, needless to say, talking about the debt situation on the continent. I had the privilege of sitting on a panel yesterday where the first remarks made by an official from one of the IFIs was that they don't see there being a debt crisis. They see, and their assessment on this, or this conclusion is informed by the fact that there isn't an arrears clearance crisis, and that the debt levels or the debt distress levels have not reached the pre-HIPC levels as they were pre-2000. So a very interesting dynamic then when we think about the interventions, the advice that our African governments are being given, but also then the political ambitions with regard to trying to completely reform or rethink the global financial architecture and rethink global economic governance. If some in the IFI world don't think that there's a debt crisis actually affecting countries in the global south. And so I do think there is an opportunity for us today over the next 90 minutes or so to interrogate this type of interpretation of the situation we're facing. And I know our panelists are going to certainly dig a little bit deeper into that claim, and I hope also the colleagues from the World Bank who produce some of these statistics will also be able to help us understand whether that claim is indeed true, or that we on this other side of the divide as civil society organizations are probably making much about nothing. So feel very welcome to this session. We're really looking forward to an exciting discussion. Let me quickly mention that this session is brought to you not just by the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AFRODAD, but also in partnership with the African Center for Energy Policy, ACET, the Stop the Bleeding Consortium that is comprised of 7 Pan-African civil society organizations. That is Tax Justice Network Africa, the Pan-African Lawyers Union, FEMNET, NAWI, AfriFem, which is a Pan-African Macroeconomic Feminist Collective, I2C Africa, and Trust Africa, the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, SEATINI, Uganda, CROSET in Chad, and the Center for Trade Policy and Development in Zambia. So to all our partners, this is a collective effort that has gone into putting this session together, and we are very grateful for that. We are going to run this. There are no PowerPoint presentations. I think you'll be glad to hear. You're probably all fatigued out of PowerPoint presentations. So we are going to try and keep it as conversational as possible. We'll have 2 segments of commentary from the panel, and then we'll open it up for reflections and responses. And we're very fortunate to have members of the Parliament from the Republic of Ghana who will hopefully give us some of their reflections on what their experience has been with getting to this point, but also from a transparency, accountability, and governance perspective, how they intend to tackle or engage in the common framework discussions. In terms of my panel, let me very quickly introduce them. We have Ms. Jane Nalunga, who is the Executive Director of SEATINI, Uganda. We have Grieve Chelwa, who is an academic with the New School in Zambia. We have Edward Brown, who is with the African Center for Economic Transformation, a Pan-African think tank working out of Ghana. And we have César Calderón, who works in the office of the Chief Economist of the World Bank. So please all feel very welcome. We're very thankful and grateful for having you join us here today. This session is also about making Africa a rule maker. This is something that AFRODAD has been championing since 2021 in the appreciation and observation that this is an opportunity for the continent to claim its rightful stake at the table in terms of how global rules and norms are defined and developed. So if you're going to use social media, please use the hashtag Africa Rulemaker as you tweet and post pictures. That would be really useful. For colleagues who are joining us online, there is a chat function where you can type in your questions. And just to remind participants who are in the room that there is translation in French to English and vice versa. So with all the logistics out of the way and a brief description of what we're here to do, let me just begin very quickly in terms of getting some initial reactions and reflections from the panel on the national dimensions of their respective debt challenges. And allow me just to start with you, Ed. Ghana for decades has been a poster child country for IMF, World Bank policy, especially in the era of structural adjustment and PRSPs. But the predicament that it finds itself in today, do you mind just telling us, how did we get here with the default shuttle diplomacy with regard to cap in hand asking for restructuring and relief? How did Ghana end up there?
Is it cap in hand? I'm not sure. Anyway, yeah, thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to be here this morning to participate in this very important conversation around debt. The Ghanaian situation dates back. It's not something you can ascribe to any of the political parties currently in the Fourth Republic. There has been, over time, the problem of poor fiscal management and poor debt management. And this cuts across all political divide. And, so in other words, there is we are not indicting any of the political parties in this. But some of the key features of the debt situation is the rapid buildup of debt immediately following the completion of the HIPC, initiative in 2007, when at the time the debt to GDP ratio was around 31%. And today, 2022, in December, the debt had actually gone up to 104% of GDP. Now, this 104% is a reflection of the DSA that the fund and the bank undertook. Because earlier on, there had been data that had been, being floated around, which gave the debt to GDP ratio much lower than that. And it's because there were certain debts, like the syndicated debts and so on, the cocoa board debt and the energy debt, which consider about 2.7% of GDP, were not part of the whole debt analysis. So in reality, the debt accumulation has been going on for several years, going on. And one of the key issues, if you look at the fiscal deficit has always been around on average since 1999 to 2021, around 6.1%. But in the election years, we see a spike, and the average has been around 8.1% of fiscal deficit in all election years, if you go back. And the outer years, the non-election years, around still 5.6%, which is still much higher than what the ECOWAS Monetary Union was, the peg in terms of the fiscal deficit. So you can see that we're not performing that well in that regard. Now, the other feature of the debt situation is that when you look at the structure of the debt, it's about 60 to 40, 60% due to domestic debt and around 38, 40% due to external. And that itself is a very serious situation because it affects resource mobilization, domestic resource mobilization. It affects individual bondholders, domestic bondholders, and so on. And there's been ongoing conversation around this issue of what you call debt exchange. And I think they're coming more and more closer to some conclusion on that. But the fact that domestic debt constitutes over 60% of total debt is really a serious problem. And if you look at also the structure in terms of the external debt, almost half of it is the private, lenders. About 13.1%, 13.1 billion of the debt, of external debt, is due to Eurobond holders. And you would see that if you look at the offering rate for Ghanaian Eurobond offerings, it ranges between 7 and 11%, which is quite high. The objective being to retire short and high interest-bearing debts. But this has not worked out in any way. So the issue of African countries not really facing a debt or liquidity crisis, I don't think, at least in the case of Ghana, the evidence is incontrovertible that at the moment you have 70% of all the debt, 70% of revenue and grants, going to debt servicing, 70%. So we don't have a fiscal space at all. When you pay civil servants, public investment is almost zero in terms of the government's own, money being used for public investment is zero. So more than 90% or 99% of all public investments are external. Bilaterals and multilaterals are providing that. So we are not growing the economy in ways that can even increase the resource mobilization capacity to be able to build the buffers, the resilience that you need to guard against external shocks. So that is the scenario today in Ghana. But I think, in fact, what led to the IMF, going back to the IMF in what they call the 17th time, going back to the IMF, is because the debt service burden has reached over 70%, and you had practically no fiscal space. Ghana has been shut out of the capital markets because it has also stopped paying its loans in the capital market. So that particular window, which is also very expensive, is also shut to the Ghanaian economy, to the Ghanaian ministry. Now, the IMF has come in and they started, I think it's in July last year, with the conversation is going on. And I think it's been, after several challenges, particularly on how do you restructure the domestic debt. And this has been a very, very charged conversation in the country where the citizens are really agitating that the government should not touch their money. But at least I think about 80% of the domestic debt, there has been some agreement on restructuring. So I think that is going on. I think what they're trying to do is to ensure that the pension funds are not touched and that they should be paid. Because this is really going to pull down, increase poverty levels. And there are a number of stark examples on the air about issues where, pensioners are really, on a warpath, on that issue. So with the IMF coming in, the conversation is still going on. I think the domestic debt issue, I'm not too sure whether it's been resolved, but at least we know that 85%, and maybe somebody from the audience can inform that 85% of the debt has been recycled in ways that is acceptable. Now, the external debt, particularly with the common framework, Ghana is the fourth country that is going on the common framework, and there is clearly, and in that regard, basically what Ghana has been trying to do is to engage with specific creditors. Already the G20 countries, I think 4 of them, Britain, France, no, 3, Britain, France, and Germany, have accepted to, allow this to continue. But again, it is not really fit for purpose if you look at it. And so Ghana has been engaging with individual creditors, and they had some conversation with China. They were in China in March, and they came back. And I think the conversation still goes on. But I think the challenge there lies in the fact that bringing the private creditors to the table has not been easy, and that is an ongoing conversation with the Ghanaian government. Then there's the issue, of course, of the SDR rechanneling and so on, which I think is important to consider, particularly the AFDB's plan, which would actually augment considerably the financing for infrastructure, health, and other things. While if it were basically an IMF, disbursement, it would even be less than 1-to-1. But with the ADB, it can be about 1-to-4. Just quadruple the investment. So I think that area needs to be carefully looked at, which is distinct from the common framework in itself. Yeah. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Ed, for that. Contextual presentation on Ghana, and Grieve, I want to come to you now because Zambia is a country that has been for many years, it's a resource-rich country, has been relatively politically stable and moving along quite nicely, and out of nowhere, I'm saying out of nowhere, but clearly you may have a different opinion on this, but to those who are not, involved in the intricacies of what's happening in Zambia, the default, the first COVID-19 default, the first African default as well, did catch many people by surprise. For those who are not familiar with the country, but I mean, what was really behind this, and that maybe people missed, and sort of the predicament it now finds itself in.
Thanks, Jason. And I think I echo my colleagues' remarks in saying thanks for bringing us together in this way, and everybody else who's made this happen. It's a useful dialogue, a useful discussion at this point in our history. You started off by saying that the default, the first COVID default came out of nowhere. But for many of us who were following the Zambian story, problems began to rear their ugly head at about 2015 or thereabouts. So we saw this kind of coming. And part of the problem is the fatal flaw that is built into the way African governments are now going to capital markets, right? This is new for African governments. For many of our countries, historically, our sources of foreign debt have been the IFIs, the MDBs, and bilateral creditors. But for the first time in our history, we could now issue bonds on international markets, right? And much of this came as a result of getting sovereign debt rating. So from Zambia's case, for example, we got a Fitch rating in 2012. a credit score of sorts in 2012. And following that credit score, all this capital flew into our country. But the fatal flaw was that a big chunk of this capital was coming in to finance infrastructure, right? Infrastructure development, which, as many people in the audience will appreciate, is a precondition for development, right? We need roads, you need hospitals, you need power stations. You know, we have a power deficit in much of our continent. So, but the fatal flaw was that this capital was coming in to finance infrastructure development, but the maturity of these bonds was 10 years. And as we all know, infrastructure takes decades to begin to reap back returns, right? I mean, even a mortgage, for crying out loud. When you go to a bank and you take out a mortgage, you're given 30 years to pay it back, right? But in our cases, our bonds were 10-year bonds to mostly finance infrastructure, whose payoff will probably start 2 or 3 decades hence. And we all know that infrastructure projects are not shovel ready, right? They take years to get off the ground, right? Many of these infrastructure projects whose bonds started coming in 2012 only started to be built in 2016, right? So I think so for many of us, we could see this fatal flaw in the design of these bonds. But I think it's also important to realize that the buildup in debt is not entirely a Zambian problem. And I like to believe it might not entirely be an African problem. It is a response to a real need to put up infrastructure, right? For many colleagues in the audience, we know historically, when our governments got independence, the first thing that they tried to do in terms of national building was to build infrastructure. And they began to invest in infrastructure projects. When the crisis came in the 80s and IFIs began to give us advice, they did say, stop wasting your time with infrastructure, right? Stop spending so much on infrastructure because you're always wasting, you're always corrupt, etc. So focus less on infrastructure. Let us focus more on other things, right? So when the new century came, the 21st century came, and by the time, say, 2010 came in Zambia, we had a huge infrastructure backlog, rundown of roads, hospitals, schools, that kind of thing. So in trying to respond to this real problem of an infrastructure deficit, what did we do? We did what everybody does. We borrowed, right? We borrowed, but then there was this fatal flaw. And then also things happened, right? At some point, climate change. We had a very big drought in 2015 that completely set us off track. Then you had COVID, right? But this is not to excuse ourselves, right? Also, I think my colleague from Ghana also makes this point. Issues of fiscal management, issues of accountability, issues of transparency. There's a big debate, for example, in Zambia as to where some of the Eurobond money went. Where did it go? It was supposed to go into railways, but what happened? Where did it go? I think there's a story in Mozambique, as colleagues know, of the tuna bond scandal. Similarly, right? All these kinds of things. So I think this is important to put in context that the debt crisis which many of our countries are facing is not one that is self-inflicted. It is one that came about as a result of responding to a real need to try to build up infrastructure. And then how do you do it? You need to borrow, right? But the instruments which were available to us at the time had this fatal flaw. And I think what is useful when, Jason, you asked the question about African rules, African participation, African agency, part of the discussion we need to have is essentially how do we set up mechanisms that allow, because we will always need to build up infrastructure. And sometimes we will not have the money domestically to do it, right? Because infrastructure, by definition, the outlays are huge and you may not be able to pay for them out of your pocket and you need to borrow. So the question we ought to be doing, I think the work that we ought to be doing is the current multilateral system or is the current mechanisms for sovereign debt flows, for flows of money from surplus countries to deficit countries like those out of ours, are those mechanisms and institutions in place to do that? Is the World Bank fit for purpose in this moment? Is the IMF fit for purpose in this moment? Is the New Development Bank, aka the BRICS Bank, fit for purpose in this moment? Sort of a corollary to that, sort of another side to that particular discussion is a discussion about how we resolve sovereign debt crisis. How do we resolve that? Do we have the mechanisms, the institutions, the institutional apparatus in place to resolve sovereign debt crisis in a timely manner, in an orderly manner? Do we have early warning systems in place to be able to pick this thing up? And I think, as my colleague from Ghana said, for example, the common framework, which seems very ad hoc. It's an ad hoc response, right? That came about with, first we had debt service suspension initiative because of COVID. And then in a panicky way, we now have the common framework, which is completely not fit for purpose, because the common framework approaches the debt problem as if we're in the 1990s, when all we had was a Paris Club, right? All we could deal with was a Paris Club, and France would represent the Paris Club. And what do you do if you're Minister of Finance in Zambia? Just go to Paris, have a conversation with the Minister of Finance in France. Over a cup of coffee, you resolve the problems. Now, the world in 2023 is completely different. We have a plethora of creditors, right, with different interests, different motivations, different geopolitical interests, etc., and all this, the common framework is supposed to resolve. And the common framework is only a club of official creditors, right? What about the private creditors? In the Zambian case, like the Ghanaian case, 50% of our external debt is to bondholders. But bondholders and commercial banks do not have a seat at the common framework. They don't. Right. So the common framework is completely not fit for purpose. I will stop now and just say, I think this is the story. And I think I hope I've presented the challenge that is before us. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Grieve, for again. I think beginning to observe or see some commonalities coming up, and hopefully for the friends from Ghana, there might be some nuanced experiences that come out from Grieve's submission that we may want to start thinking about as civil society organizations, as academics, as researchers, as parliamentarians, on how then we tackle some of the challenges that are likely to come up in the negotiations when the accredited committee under the common framework is set up. And I know we will sort of come back in the second segment to go a bit more in detail. But I want to turn now to Jane, in terms of the experience in Uganda, where there has been a lot of growing concern from civil society organizations, even the parliament to a large extent, around the unhealthy financial position of the country. I think there have been several reports where Parliament has rejected supplementary budgets because of the manner in which resources are being utilized in the country, and the worrisome debt situation in Uganda. But having listened to both Ed and Grieves, I mean, are there some common drivers that Uganda is also experiencing that's pushing the country to take on more debt at a time when policy space for many of our African governments is also quickly contracting and narrowing?
Okay, thank you so much, Jason, and I'm happy to be here as to have this conversation around debt. I'm from Uganda, and as you have said, the situation in Uganda is the same as in the rest of Africa, because most countries are either in a debt crisis or debt distress, and I don't know the definition, whether I don't know the difference, whether you are in a crisis or in distress, but I think that the situation is we are not in a good place, whether in Uganda or any other country. In Uganda, our total debt stock is almost twice our annual budget. In that, if we can stop everything, we don't do anything, it can take us 2 years to pay our debt, what we have. And for the last 5 years, our debt has been increasing. Almost now, it's almost 50% to GDP, debt to GDP. But you have to remember our economy was debased and some figures were changed, so we don't know exactly where we are. When it comes to debt servicing, almost we spend almost 34-35% of our domestic revenue on servicing that debt. And this is more than what we are spending on social services, on health, on water, on education, on agriculture combined, you know. So the situation is really, really bad. So you asked about the drivers. And I go back to what Edward has raised. The drivers, there is an actual need for countries to be able, and what Grieve raised, to be able to for government to have resources to finance development, you know, because most of our governments have national development plans to be able to reinvest, to be able to have infrastructure, but the resources are not there. So we are borrowing. But then also there are challenges internally in the way we borrow. We have talked about the tuna bond, and we see a lot of, you know, bonds going around, the green bond for climate change, the orange bond for women, you know, a number of bonds. There are monies around there, which is also a challenge in the way we are, you know, our governments, they have that high appetite, you know, to be able to get these resources. And also the issue which Grieve has raised, that the government is borrowing on the domestic level, borrowing from private sector. They don't I don't think they ask any questions. They don't ask, you know, it's flexible, easy to get, but then it's difficult to repay because the interest rates are high and the repayment period very, very short. And I think this also brings up the issue of the oversight role. I understand there are some members of parliament here. Maybe they will tell us what they are doing to, you know, to be able to oversee why, you know, that issue of the way we are borrowing, right, you know, everywhere. So what are the drivers, really, actual drivers of borrowing? Because I have said it's because the ends are not meeting their actual needs. We need to finance our development, but what we mobilize locally is not enough, you know. And I think for me, I think we need to, when we are discussing the issue of the debt crisis, we need to look at the short-term and medium measures, then the long-term measures. Because if we stay around looking for, I know in the short term, something has to be done. We need a restructuring. Some people are talking about debt cancellation, but something has to be done. But in the medium and long term, we need to ask ourselves, why are we where we are? And this is, Jason, the question you were asking. Why are we here? Where are we are? But we were here before. We're in the same position. Although they are telling us we are not yet there, but we are there, you know. So why are we where we are? I think that's an issue which we need to address as we move forward, because that will provide a long-term solution to the challenges we have. And I think we need to address issues of, for example, leakages from our economy. You know, it's like our economy is like a bucket, you know, full of holes where we put money and everything goes away, you know, in terms of IFFs, tax avoidance, you know, the weak tax system where we are not taxing enough, tax evasion, and all those, you know, those challenges. And those are issues which we need also to be able to address, to ensure that, you know, our monies are retained internally. Because at the end of the day, really, Africa, we are, you know, there's a lot of extraction of value and resources. And you see the money which our resources which go out, because we are net exporters of finance, but it comes back as capital, profit-seeking finance. And again, more resources are extracted and the cycle goes on and on. So we need to address, in the long term, we need to address that issue. But I also want to address the issue of what Edward raised, the issue of the economy. You can't have a commodity-dependent economy and you think about getting out of the challenge of the debt crisis, because we are producing and exporting raw materials, coffee, cotton, minerals, and the price on the world market are fluctuating every day. Every day it's fluctuating. And then, there's no value addition. We don't have any industries. And when you look at all these documents, Agenda 2060, Agenda 2020, SDGs, they are talking about structural transformation. That developing countries should structurally transform their countries, add value, retain that value internally, create jobs, create decent employment, and strengthen the economy. But in order to address all these issues, there are internal policies which have to change, but the global trade architecture has to change also. So in conclusion, Jason, I think we need to look at the issue of debt more broader, because today when we talk about debt sustainability, it's like we are being put on an IV, that's debt sustainability. And I think we need to change the definition and concept of debt sustainability. Debt sustainability should come from a strong economy, that when we borrow, we have the ability to pay back. But if you are talking about debt sustainability in terms of restructuring, in terms of, then it can't work. Thank you very much.